Here's the deal. It is not your role to act as the punching bag and regulation tool for a person who is always managing rage and suspiciousness and is impulsive in their words and behavior. You are not responsible for their history, and frankly, you enduring their BS is not helping them either. This really is the question that everyone asks me. How? How did this happen? Why is my brother like this? And my sister and I are not. How is my oldest child a narcissist, but not their sibling? Why is anyone like this? Sometimes this question is a curiosity, and sometimes this question is a plea to help a person avoid it. Sometimes this question is asked to try and foster some empathy. So maybe if I just understand where this narcissism in this person comes from, then maybe I can navigate this relationship better. But most often, this question comes from parents who do not want to raise a narcissistic child, especially if the parent themselves had a narcissistic parent themselves. So in other words, they don't want this to be intergenerational. So the why of narcissism, and more specifically the where does it come from, is one of the most compelling questions that people ask me. Some people push back asking, why the hell, Dr. Ramani, are we spending so much damn time talking about the narcissist? We should talk more about what happens to those of us who are being harmed. And yep, I agree with you 100%. But part of understanding the harm is understanding the weapon. It's understanding what underlies what's bringing this harm into your life. And for many folks out there, especially parents who are raising children, and especially in those who are co-parenting with narcissistic people whom they are either still in a relationship with or whom they are co-parenting with and are no longer together with a narcissistic co-parent, there is a real desire to do anything to increase the odds of avoiding raising a narcissistic child. There are no guarantees. You can follow all of what is laid out in this series and still may end up seeing these patterns in an adult child. Now, this series breaks down something called the etiology or the origins of narcissism. No one of these reasons is a slam dunk. A person emerges as an adult narcissist. It's likely all of these reasons together and to varying degrees, like making a stew. This series is a guide on how not to parent, on how not to be present with a child, and can give us insight into the people around us, our children, or if you suspect you may have narcissistic patterns, some of the origins that underlie your personality, right? And I say that tongue in cheek. Obviously, I don't want you to raise a narcissistic child. Here's the thing. This series is absolutely not meant to serve as an excuse for narcissistic behavior. It's not. So please don't take it in that way. It is terrible that some of the things I'm going to talk about in this series would happen to someone. But lots of people have these backstories of all these different origins of narcissism and don't develop narcissistic personalities. Understanding what underlies the origins of narcissism may help set you free from the idea that the behavior that you are witnessing in a narcissistic relationship is your fault. And to the parents out there, you may in retrospect look back and say, damn, I have done some of the things you've talked about in this series, and here I have a narcissistic adult child. This series is also not meant to foist blame on you. Trust me when I tell you, lots of parents have done far, far worse, and their children are doing fine and are not narcissistic. I've seen solid, relatively on point, like loving parents have narcissistic children, and I've seen neglectful, unkind, selfish parents that have really empathic, respectful, and healthy children. Parenting is about sacrifice, being present, emotional availability, boundaries, consistency, but also a really large dose of luck, mixed in with something called your child's inborn temperament. Speaking of which, that's where we're going to start this series, by talking about something called temperament. Temperament is sort of the biological part of your personality. It's the part of our personality that we're kind of born with. And many of us can see, especially as we come into adulthood, that we have mannerisms and quirks that sometimes resemble those that are in other family members that we may not have even had that much contact with growing up or may have never even met. Temperament is likely, in large part, genetic, and we see it as early as infancy. Any of you watching this who has had more than one child knows darn well that your multiple babies had different temperaments from day one. Now, children with difficult or fussy temperaments have kind of pulled the short straw when it comes to temperament because they are harder to parent. They may cry more often, they may be harder to soothe, they may not sleep as well, they may act out behaviorally more, they may simply just be more demanding and thus have exhausted parents and caregivers. This can impact some of the other stuff we will talk about in this series, like mirroring and attachment. This difficult temperament may evolve with the child and may present with the child being very attention-seeking or physically active or remaining difficult to soothe or being, again, very reactive or being impulsive. These are kids that it's not a walk in the park. And over time, that child may have less than pleasant interactions with the world. They may be frequently scolded, hearing lots of, "Stop that, sit down, oh, why are you such a handful?" Or they may even face a greater likelihood of physical or abuse or verbal abuse by frustrated, overwhelmed parents. Not that those things are ever okay, but that's often why the parents go there. Some of these temperament interactions with the world can lay down some of the groundwork for later narcissism. The challenging temperament of the child, combined with less than optimal interactions with the world, all of this can leave the child feeling quite insecure and constantly trying to look to others for approval, but not being able to sort of contain that kind of acting out style. Now, Marsha Linehan, when she writes about borderline personality disorder, which is very closely related to narcissistic personality, suggested a sort of 2x2 framework. She puts biological vulnerability, temperament basically on one side, calls it high and low, and then she talks about the quality of the early environment, and she classifies that as invalidating or healthy. Now, as you can imagine, those with a higher biological vulnerability, these more sensitive temperaments, and a highly invalidating early environment, those are the people who are more likely to go on to develop maladaptive and dysregulated personality styles. This biological vulnerability takes in a little bit of territory. A lot of it includes temperament, as well as patterns such as reactivity and, of course, genetics. On the other side, those folks who don't have the biological vulnerability, who are raised in really validating and healthy early environments, well, that's the winner, folks, with a much greater probability of longer-term good mental health and a lower probability of a maladaptive personality style. This biological vulnerability that Dr. Linehan writes about often plays out as a reactive sensitivity that is present from early in life, which, like I said, then interacts with the child's early environment. This implies that even under the best of circumstances, in the face of having a biological vulnerability, it is quite possible that a narcissistic or otherwise pretty darn difficult and dysregulated and antagonistic and narcissistic adult could emerge. But the 1-2 punch is when the biological interacts with the environmental. For this reason, it may be that a child that is raised in a healthy, validating, loving home, but if the biological vulnerability is there, then there is still a risk of development of narcissism or related personality styles in adulthood. And that biological vulnerability may be why someone comes out of a very loving family and is still quite narcissistic. It's a developmental question, but it is possible that these difficult to soothe, reactive temperaments in children may be the forerunners of the behavioral issues that these kids will go on to have in school. Again, if kids behaving badly in school, the teachers are also going to be invalidating, or the kid may act out or be oppositional, and these behaviors may persist in adulthood. Many narcissistic adults throughout adulthood remain impulsive, behaviorally dysregulated, and oppositional. Temperament matters. It often sets the tone for where our adult personality lands. Now, some children with very challenging temperaments can ultimately grow up into regulated and lovely adults, and some really difficult and antagonistic adults had sweet temperaments. None of this is absolute, but it really comes down to probabilities. And it's a good bet that many people with narcissistic personalities reflect this multiplication between an invalidating, neglectful, inconsistent early environment and a biological vulnerability through their temperament. This temperament issue may also be why those who have known the narcissistic person the longest will say, I know they seem tough, but they've always been like this. Because in many ways, they have always been like this. The one thing we learn from the temperament element is that it is not a guarantee that a difficult temperament will evolve into adulthood narcissism, but it's a wake-up call that environment matters and may be the only way to steer a difficult temperament into a greater likelihood of a healthy adulthood space. It's a tall order, since difficult temperaments may raise more parenting issues, but again, awareness becomes key of how much more careful a parent may need to be with a difficult temperament child. One of the most difficult things about understanding narcissism is how diverse the pathways are to get to this narcissistic personality. At the core of all of these patterns is clearly something biological that we still don't fully understand. It largely appears to be a temperament by environment interaction, and that temperament is biologically determined and inborn. And the issues we will take on in this series are the environmental things that will often turn on that temperament and take it down a more narcissistic path. And even with the temperament and the environment interaction, that temperament may still not turn into adult narcissism. And in some cases, when we tell the story backwards, it just doesn't add up, meaning that we can't figure out quite what led to a person's narcissism. But in the vast majority of cases, the pieces do make sense. We can tell this story. So let's start from the very top with trauma. Why is trauma associated with narcissism? And what does a more post-traumatic narcissism look like? Please keep in mind, not all trauma histories are associated with narcissism, and not all narcissistic people have histories of trauma. Please remember that. But trauma, especially while the brain is still developing quickly, which is infancy, kind of through emerging adulthood, impacts how a person processes the world, how they feel the world. Post-trauma is characterized by patterns like vigilance and fear and threat perception and impulsivity and poorly managed emotion, either too much or too little, and re-experiencing and avoidance. Trauma can be seen in the histories of a not insignificant number of narcissistic individuals, and often shows up most often in people with vulnerable and sometimes malignant narcissistic patterns. In narcissistic people with trauma histories behind them, we can see the constant perceptions of threat to the point of what almost looks like paranoia, and this thin-skinned aggression in the face of provocation, the limited empathy, the impulsivity, all very much can track back to early trauma histories. Then, if the trauma was perpetrated by family members, especially parents or older siblings, or through witnessing domestic violence, then deviant, cruel behavior was also modeled by these people and may show up in the behavior of the narcissistic person in adulthood, who is in essence repeating what they saw. For folks with these histories, with trauma histories, if they go to therapy, ideally there is trauma-informed work happening, somatic work, the series of best practices in trauma. Unfortunately, once the therapeutic work becomes emotionally vulnerable, narcissistic folks tend to drop out of therapy and the beat goes on. Post-traumatic narcissistic patterns can be really problematic. Lots of suspiciousness, bordering on paranoia, aggressiveness, menace, manipulation. It does not feel safe for the other person in the relationship with the narcissistic person. The challenge is that when someone in a relationship with a narcissistic person who has a trauma history learns that that trauma history may have contributed to that person's narcissistic personality pattern, there are tons and tons of cognitive dissonance. First, the trauma actually makes sense as a way to make sense of such a hostile and difficult pattern. And the idea that if you stepped away, you would be one more person who is harming them. But also, if you stand up to them, that you have to endure their rage, and that can feel scary. Many times, when a person recognizes that a partner or other significant person in their life has a trauma history, there's a strong sense of guilt that in some ways it may just have to be your lot in life to have to just put up and shut up because they, the narcissistic person, had their own burdens to carry, and you don't want to add to that. But here's the deal. It is not your role to act as the punching bag and regulation tool for a person who is always managing rage and suspiciousness and is impulsive in their words and behavior. You are not responsible for their history, and frankly, you enduring their BS is not helping them either, though they will lash out at you in a way that may leave you feeling as though you have done something wrong for not enduring their behavior. You can't win. And if they are not getting help, such as therapy, and instead are getting through their days by bullying you and everyone else, again, not acceptable. It is painful to know that their histories and legacies have harmed them so much. That's an empathic reaction. And being an adult, though, for them means making the choice to do something about it. For them to take responsibility, to recognize that their behavior is unacceptable, they have to recognize that and then grow up and take that responsibility. Or they just have to be accountable and leave relationships where they are doing so much harm. They don't get to have it both ways. It can get very tricky if they use their histories in a manipulative manner, especially when they recognize that such a strategy is working. They'll say things like, I had such a tough childhood. I watched my dad beat up my mom. I was assaulted. And hearing those things keeps you stuck. After a while, they know they can pull out that card and get you to not leave or hold them behaviorally accountable or just put up with them. That's not a relationship, folks. That is psychological imprisonment. Of all the narcissistic backstories, or origins backstories, I should say, I do believe that this results in some of the more severe narcissistic symptomatology for people who do have narcissistic personalities, and results in the most cognitive dissonance for survivors. But there's one last thing you need to remember. The majority of people who endure trauma in childhood and adolescence do not develop adult narcissistic personalities. So it's not a given. And many of those folks who have experienced trauma either did the hard work of therapy or may have had very, very different temperaments. However, when a person's narcissistic behavior has trauma in the backstory, it makes it very hard for narcissistic abuse survivors and for the person with the narcissistic personality style as well. It's just a tough one. There are therapists out there who are very, very skilled and specialized at trauma work, and it is painful, difficult work, but it's important work. If you believe you have a narcissistic personality style and you think it relates to your trauma history, please look into it, because lashing out at others because of that is not a path forward to you. And addressing the trauma is essential to living a more whole life. If you are in a relationship with someone who is narcissistic and has an earlier life history of trauma, ensure you have supports and ideally therapy for yourself. if you're concerned that there are safety issues in this relationship, we will have resources for that in the video notes. And your staying in the relationship may help you in the way of not having to grapple with the guilt. But let me tell you, that's not good for you, because it's not doing you, the other person, and others who are caught in the blast zone of this relationship and of this person's behavior any favors. I will say it again and again. There is no excuse for abuse. There are explanations, but there's no excuse. There is no backstory that makes it okay. These explanations may give us a structure within which to understand it, but not to sign off on it. So understanding origin, I know it's something that's so compelling, but that origin cannot be used as a tool of self-blame for survivors or an excuse for behavior by people who are narcissistic. All of this is about stepping up and taking responsibility, painful as it may be. So please drop a comment. What do you think? Do you think that coming from chaotic family systems just begets more narcissism? Do you think narcissism is genetic? Do you think everyone who comes from one of these family systems is doomed to become narcissistic? Now, people sometimes wonder, if a person's family is like this, pure chaos and just lots of lies, deceit, you name it, doesn't it just follow that this is genetic? If a person's parent or parents or other family members are narcissistic, that these patterns might be observed in grandparents or aunts and uncles or siblings, then doesn't that just argue that all of this is genetic? We don't know, but probably not. A lot of what comprises narcissistic behavior and narcissistic beliefs is a byproduct of observation and learning and being immersed in behavioral patterns that may not be normative, but may be seen or observed in many family members in a particular family. Most people do what they see, or I shouldn't say most, many people do what they see, but not all of us do, thank goodness, right? The genetic evidence on psychopathy, that's a bit more convincing than what we see for other personality issues. But even in psychopathy, the thing that's being sort of genetically inherited isn't the psychopathy per se, but the ingredients of the psychopathy, the dysregulation, the impulsivity, perhaps the lack of empathy, perhaps issues related to mirror neurons. This is all an evolving field, but it's not like, ooh, there's a psychopathy gene, right? The genetic versus the environmental issues get mixed up again when we consider other co-occurring mental health and mental illness issues, patterns that we often see co-occur with narcissistic personality. So this could be things like the presence of mood disorders, such as depression and bipolar disorder and addiction. Now, those patterns, mood disorders and addiction, those have all been shown to be heritable. And when you have these parallel patterns, that they're parallel to personality issues like dysregulated behavior, impulsivity, variable empathy, and then other patterns like denial, problems with self-awareness. When you have this big mishmash of major mental illness and these personality issues, teasing all of this out becomes really, really difficult because there's just lots of chaos, right? So the really, really difficult and challenging piece, and this may apply to more than a few of you, is that you come from a family in which deviant, dysregulated, antagonistic, just plain chaotic patterns were happening all around you and harming you. And you didn't take that path, or your siblings didn't. You actually you didn't end up making your own family that's chaotic and all of that, but instead you ended up as an empathic, productive, well-regulated adult. Though I will say that many people who originate from chaotic families, if they don't become chaotic themselves, they end up quite anxious as adults. Now, a narcissistic family system or a psychopathic family system sort of has its own weather, right? It has its own culture. This may look different in different families, right? In different families, we might see families where rules are regularly broken. Even laws might be regularly broken. Oppositionality and just saying no is tolerated. Behaviors such as infidelity or lying are observed across multiple family members. Physical abuse or violence may occur regularly. Substance use is present in multiple family members. Domestic violence is observed. Manipulative, sort of ragey behavior is excused. These systems, these narcissistic family systems, get to keep working because the people with the antagonistic patterns hold most of the power in the system, and for no other reason usually but fear. Some people walk on eggshells and others enable it, saying things like, well, families stick together, family is family, family loyalty, that sort of thing. Survival in these kinds of antagonistic family cultures often comes through escape, but also by building resilience in whatever way you can, going to therapy, setting boundaries. But family cultures like this often try to pull people back into them. And if you manage to escape and create a healthier life outside of that chaotic family system that you came from, then pulling you back through guilt is a very common play in these families, with family members, the enablers, and the narcissists asking for money or a place to stay, and that you somehow owe continuing to give to the family system. Another thing happens in antagonistic family systems. In many cases, there's basically nobody minding the store, meaning that children in the environment are not kept safe. That can be things like routines and schedules and expectations are lacking. And even if there is a kind person in this chaotic family system, they are often living in fear or trauma or stress, and they can't adequately caregive the children. And exposure to these environments can really disrupt attachment processes. In some cases, this chaos results in what are called traumatogenic or unsafe environments in which strangers or unsafe people who are part of the system are then able to easily enter into these environments, may even prey upon children in these environments, again, because the chaos means that nobody is keeping an eye out for the vulnerable people in the system. And then, as you can imagine, some children at risk, because of being in that risky environment in their family, they may be more vulnerable to trauma even outside of the home and may not have someone monitoring their safety and accountability as they get older, middle school, adolescence, that kind of thing. These are children who may then be more vulnerable to engaging in experimental drug use, largely because it's probably happening in the family. They may run away. They may not do as well in school. They may act out in school. So the legacies created by these dysfunctional, abusive, narcissistic, antagonistic environments radiate outward and harm the people who are born into them. Sometimes these patterns replicate across generations. When we are exposed to anything, rage, dishonesty, betrayal, observing or experiencing various forms of abuse, substance use, some people become what's called habituated to it. What I'm basically saying is that basically people almost become accustomed to seeing these things and then may not even take as much notice of it when it happens in other places. It's almost like an acculturation process, right? For example, if they see this kind of behavior in relationships or workplaces, and there's a danger to getting habituated or accustomed to these patterns. Many people who are from ragey, abusive families have said, the yelling and the abuse was normative in my family. It wasn't okay, but it also meant that when I got into adulthood, I didn't notice that kind of ragey behavior as much when I entered other relationships. Yes, some people say they're more sensitive to it, but a lot of people say, I'm not noticing it as much. I was once chatting with a friend of mine, and she happened to be dating a ragey narcissist. I asked her as gently as I could, doesn't his yelling scare you? Because I got to tell you, it scared the hell out of me. And she said, I know he yells, but he isn't yelling at me. And I grew up with a father who was way more rageful and yelling. And I knew my dad loved me. And so yelling doesn't put me off. I thought it was actually a very interesting justification. I got to tell you, I still worry about her. I'd love to hear it from you. Drop a comment. Did you grow up with a narcissistic family member? And did the abuse in the family become so normative that you didn't notice it as much when it happened in other relationships? Keep in mind, for some of you, it might mean you notice it more. I'm somebody who does not do well. Somebody's yelling and screaming. I actually tend to sort of shake like a feather. Now, however, there's another side to this. Our nervous systems don't like yelling and fear and violence and anger happening around us, which is why in people who grew up in these systems, there is sort of a permanent eggshell walking. It's the hypervigilance and the hyperarousal that's observed in people who have long-term traumatic stress reactions. There's a sort of a jumpiness, a discomfort, an anxiety at saying and doing the wrong thing, and a tendency for self-blame. Even when a person is in a calm and safe environment, the hypervigilance and that sort of jitteriness persists. And in the world of narcissistic abuse, this can get this can get complicated in multiple ways. For people who may get into a relationship with someone who is narcissistically or psychopathically abusive in adulthood, and they come to find out that the toxic person they are in a relationship with came from one of these adverse and chaotic environments, the tendency is to want to save them, rescue them, help them, make justifications, not want to punish them for their difficult backstory. That's understandable. It's compassionate, it's empathic, and it often doesn't work. Sadly, we do need to make decisions about people on the basis of their behavior, their present behavior. You can't be the therapist to someone that you are in a relationship with. Justifying and waiting for change is more likely to result in more harm to you. If you came from a family like this and aren't like this, but still struggle with anxiety, attachment, and feeling not good enough, then you do often carry a greater vulnerability to trauma bonding and getting into a relationship that replicates these cycles again. Understanding these kinds of risk factors and your history is essential. That's why it's so important to pace relationships really slowly. Give yourself time to adjust, to get to know yourself, to value yourself. And then on top of that, self-compassion becomes absolutely essential. And finally, a point for everyone to remember. While our families obviously have in many ways shaped us developmentally, they don't define us. There are people who emerge from systems like this with some real core wounds and with rich empathic hearts. Simply being from a psychopathic or a narcissistic or a chaotic or an antagonistic family system absolutely does not mean that all hope is lost. We can't justify bad behavior in present time on the behalf of that family of origin issue, but we also can't, wouldn't reject people out of hand on this behalf. That history doesn't damn everyone. Adult behavior is the adult's responsibility. Our histories create vulnerabilities, but they are not excuses for bad behavior. Now, in the 1950s, a psychiatrist named John Bowlby and a psychologist named Mary Ainsworth laid out a developmental model called attachment theory. This model focused on our earliest relationships, typically with parents or other early primary caregivers. They showed that a child needs a solid, secure, consistent relationship with just one solid, safe, secure, and available adult caregiver to set the foundation for normal development. That adult becomes a sort of base camp for the child. And if the child is at all stressed, where do they want to be? They want to be near their safe base. These researchers also focused on understanding how infants reacted to a separation, even a brief separation, from their primary caregiver, or to the moments when their caregiver wasn't readily available. Now, in their definition, a good caregiver is someone who is available, consistent, and responsive. And the child wants to know that the caregiver is close and connected. If a caregiver is not available or responsive, then the child will be anxious and will search their environment or will cry or do something else to call out for the caregiver. If the caregiver does not show up, then the baby will experience despair. Now, I would love to hear, though, drop a comment if you ever remember learning about attachment, maybe in a psychology class, maybe in other things that you've read. It'd be interesting to know how many of us already know about this idea of attachment theory. Now, it's normal for young children to become upset when their caregiver leaves. It's also normal for a child to be calmed down rather quickly by that caregiver when they return. There is lots of information out there on attachment theory if you want to learn more. For example, about something called the strange situation experiment, etc. It's really interesting stuff. You may have learned about it in school. But suffice it to say, a child, all children, need a consistent, safe person in their lives to develop a healthy sense of self and a healthy psychological development. Bowlby and Ainsworth and other researchers subsequent to them describe different attachment styles, including a secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. Since then, others have also added what's called the disorganized attachment style. Now, secure attachment is what we see when we see a child who is a little sad when their parent leaves, but then they're soothed by whomever the other caregivers might be. It might be a babysitter or a teacher. And then when the parent comes back to them, the child is quickly soothed by their parent's return. The anxious attachment style is when the child becomes extremely rattled and upset when the parent departs. And it's hard to soothe the child even when the parent comes back. In the anxious attachment style, the child will go back and forth between wanting to be comforted and then wanting to punish the parent for leaving. Now, for those of you dealing with narcissistic relationships in adulthood, does that sound familiar? The push-pull of them, wanting you to reassure them and then wanting to punish you? Definitely drop in a comment if you've seen that kind of anxious attachment style play out in adulthood. Now, finally, in the avoidant attachment pattern, children do not get too upset when the parent leaves. And when their parent returns, they actively avoid them. Now, researchers Cynthia Hazan and Philip Shaver have also talked about adult attachment styles. Securely attached adults are sad when they have to say goodbye to their loved ones or partners, especially to their partners. And then they're genuinely happy and elevated when they come back together with their partner. Avoidant adults, they don't really care that much about close relationships. And they don't want to be dependent or don't really care about other people. So they don't care about goodbye and they don't really care about hello. But when it comes to narcissistic relationships, it really appears to relate most closely to how Shaver and Hazan write about anxiously attached adults. Anxiously attached adults are always worried that other people do not love them and become frustrated when their needs are not met. People who are narcissistic most often look anxiously attached. They are always worried that whomever they proclaim to love will not return their love, and they get rageful when their needs are not met. So then comes that punitive part. In a way, the anxiously attached adult mirrors their punitive anger at their caregiver from childhood, right? They're still mad about that. They take it out in the adult relationship. The anxiously attached adult is often inconsistent, cold, rejecting, and unempathic with their partners, and they're upset when their needs don't get met. This anxious attachment style can also sort of result in sort of an obsessive style that is very much a signature of the narcissistic relationship. Narcissistic folks are caught in a constant push-pull in their relationships, and that's why we see the constant and dramatic arguments, breaking up and getting back together. Lots of anxiety, begging the partner to come back, the hoovering. It's that anxious attachment come to life in its adult form. And that's really what a lot of narcissistic relationships look like. In a lot of the theoretical research on adult narcissism, there is definitely the suggestion that many, if not most, narcissistic people have an anxious attachment style. Lots of volatility. They definitely don't do well with goodbyes. They also don't do well with hellos, especially if there's been a separation. In a way, the narcissistic adult is still the angry child that can't believe that you left home, even if it's just to go to work, right? And there's lots of punitive acting out in the relationship. That means that people who do therapy with narcissistic people try to address that anxious attachment by being consistently available at that session time, right? The consistent available parent. Now, narcissistic clients often try to take advantage of that. They will frequently try to touch base with or even bother the therapist in between sessions. They want to have access to them all the time. So the work becomes letting the client know, I am here for you every week at this time. This is your time. But I can't be there for you all the time throughout the week. Setting that boundary and setting the consistency basically alongside the healthy boundaries they never had. None of this really ever works with the narcissistic client, which is actually why narcissistic clients often burn therapists out. The therapist keeps setting boundaries, the client keeps claiming to have emergencies, or they keep sending messages or communications to the therapist keeps setting higher boundaries, and either the client gets frustrated that they cannot always use the therapist as a pacifier, and then they drop out of therapy, or the therapist burns out altogether and either drops the client or, in some cases, literally stops being a therapist. So a parent doesn't really have the same option, but you could see the effect that that child might have had on a parent as well. Now, where do anxious attachments come from? Now, lots of places. Unavailable caregivers in childhood, and this can be for such a wide range of reasons. Perhaps the caregivers are actually gone and there is no good substitute. It could be due to chaos in the household, parents who are preoccupied with stressors, parents who are egocentric, parents who are just immersed in their own lives and interests and are maybe perhaps narcissistic themselves and don't want to be bothered with children. The child, in these cases, where there's inconsistent parents, never gets that secure base to return to, never learns to feel safe and secure in the world, and may feel a constant sense of being left or abandoned, and then has difficulty regulating or soothing themselves. And this extends into adult relationships. And in adult relationships, there can be lots of anxiety about abandonment, a neediness or a clinginess, and rage at the partner because of this anxiety, and to punish them for not being available to them all the time. Now, here's an interesting paradox. When people recognize that anxious attachment is a big part of what may underlie adult narcissistic styles, becomes sort of an interesting setup for cognitive dissonance for the person who's in the relationship with the narcissistic person. Because then the rescuer hat goes on. And the belief is that if I am always there for them. And I am now the new consistent parent, and I'm available, and I'm loving, then I can fix their anxious attachment. Nope, not going to happen. You can't, and frankly, it's not your job. It's not your place or need as a partner to reparent your partner. Their work is to do the hard work of therapy and to work through this in therapy, as uncomfortable as it may be. You are not their abandoning, unavailable parent, and nothing you can say or do is going to change that. And as you can see, if you fall into this trauma-bonded, I am going to fix this attachment issue for you role, you, in essence, have, instead of being a partner, really become the parent of a tantruming, dysregulated child, again, instead of being an adult partner to another adult. Now, the attachment origin model of narcissism is one of the more robust and likely useful explanatory models. It explains why we see narcissistic personality across all groups, all over the world, and across even socioeconomic groups. For example, there may be different reasons why a wealthy parent is not available to a child compared to why a person of fewer economic resources may not be available to a child, but the child experiences it the same way, and it can have similar impacts. It also explains the challenges that we see that narcissistic people have with both intimacy and empathy. It explains all of the challenges with dysregulation and the incapacity to engage in something called self-soothing. It explains the abandonment fears and the anger that narcissistic people often display, not just when you say goodbye, but even when you reconnect. It explains the vindictiveness and the punitiveness of these relationships. So it's a theory that really does kind of reach into all the kinds of corners of narcissism, and it makes sense of a lot of it. So let's say you're a parent still raising a child and you don't want to raise a narcissistic child. What do? Try to be consistent, available, responsive, and present. Be that secure base for your child. The younger and the more consistently this happens, the better. As I said, you are base camp and the safe place that lets the child get more bold and courageous with regard to exploring their world. Number 2, you got to put down the devices and just be with them. You got to learn to reflect their emotions. Have good routines around goodbyes and hellos. Goodbyes and hellos for children can be rather challenging and chaotic moments for a child. Whatever you do, you can have a song, you can have a routine, you can have a little pinky handshake, and that you can then harness at the time that you can use at the time of hello and of goodbye to make those sort of soothing times. Make those reunions very present, right? It's easy to say, okay, hey, it's good to see you again. All right, let's get in the car. Be present at hello, be present at goodbye, but have that hello routine and that goodbye routine. Be aware of your own attachment style and attachment issues, as those are going to play a role in how you are present with your own child. For example, an anxiously attached parent may tend to be a little bit more hovery and not allow their child enough leeway to safely explore. Or an anxiously attached parent may portray the world to be a dangerous place to a child because of their own anxieties. Number 5, remember that it only takes one securely attached person in a child's life to help them feel securely attached. You may be concerned because you have a difficult or a narcissistic co-parent. It's okay. A child just needs one secure base. It's not obviously optimal for a child to have a negating parent, but in those early years, if you are able to be that for your child as their one good solid caregiver, you may be good. Your child will probably still grapple with anxiety from having a narcissistic parent, but you still could have given them that secure base. I'd love to hear, is there anything else you've done to try to avoid raising a narcissistic child, especially when you think about it in terms of attachment? Please leave a comment and let us know. As a child gets older, it does get a little harder to shift the course of attachment. A lot of this stuff gets set in early childhood, but always remember that brains are neuroplastic. They can change. And so I'm a believer that it is never too late to get good attachment practices into place as a parent. These attachment issues are a pillar of the origin of narcissism. And many of us can see how our own attachment styles very much impact us in adulthood. I mean, listen, would that we lived in a world of all full of securely attached people. It would be harmonious and kind and balanced and less violent. But here's the rub, gang. That is not the world that we live in. I hope all of this sheds some light on attachment and on narcissism. But I also want to make one other point. It's interesting. There's been some emails and comments like saying, I listen to these videos, but sometimes I'm worried, are you blaming the parents for their narcissistic children? No. The fact is, I have seen parents who have more than one child, 2, 3, 4 kids. One kid in the family is really narcissistic, and they have 3 really nice kids who are empathic and kind and compassionate. So the fact of the matter is, as you remember from other videos in this series, there's also that temperamental piece, that genetic part of personality. We're still learning about the genetics of narcissism. We're still learning about the origins of it. While obviously we want to give our kids the best leg up in terms of giving them healthy personalities, but I myself have worked with families where there have been 2 absolutely devoted, available, present parents, where the child, by all best reports, had a secure attachment. And then I'm working with the family, and they have adult children who are ragingly narcissistic. And they did a good job as parents. So please know that this is not meant to say, oh, that reason my kid's narcissistic is I was not a secure caregiver. You may very well have been. There may have been other disruptions. You may have had a malignant narcissistic spouse or a difficult narcissistic spouse, which also made it harder. Temperament may have played a role. So please understand, there are in more cases than not, every kid in the family is not narcissistic. It's one, and there are others that are healthy. We still are trying to figure out there are no absolutes when it comes to human development. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe. Thank you for joining this community. You're being a part of it, and you sharing it and liking it ensures that this content gets to more people so more and more folks understand narcissistic abuse. Thanks again.